Dr. Olsen is on sabbatical right now, and he's writing his next book, The Divine Proportion. Would you please welcome warmly Scott Olsen.
Thank you very much, and it's a real honor to be here. Perhaps while people are still kind of filtering in, I'll start with maybe a bit of a little humor. I know some of you have heard this before. I just got this from this sweet little lady who is a good friend, and it's a story of someone who had a near-death experience. A 54-year-old woman had a heart attack and was taken to the hospital. While on the operating table, she had a near-death experience. Seeing God, she asked, "Is my time up?" God said, "No. You have another 43 years, 2 months, and 8 days to live." Upon recovery, the woman decided to stay in the hospital and have a facelift, a tummy tuck, liposuction, and breast implants. She even had someone come in and change her hair color and brighten her teeth. Since she had so much time to live, she figured she might as well make the most of it. After her last operation, she was released from the hospital. While crossing the street on her way home, she was killed by an ambulance. Arriving in front of God, she angrily demanded, "I thought you said I had another 43 years. Why didn't you pull me from out of the path of the ambulance?" God replied, "Shit, I didn't recognize you." Okay, my talk today is near-death experiences and self-transformation. Life-changing illumination is humanity's ultimate goal. And you will quickly recognize that I have a kind of a thesis that it's the mathematics, and Plato would actually say the geometry, that is the key to consciousness, to life. And I think probably the best way to start is to clue you in on notions of ratio, so that doesn't come up as a question later on. In the Greek, the word is logos. Logos primarily, yes, it does mean verb and word, but it means ratio. Ratio is relationship. So for example, and you read left to right, so I'll hold 2 pens up, you can see them, and 1 pen. So what's the ratio of this, the 2 to 1? 2 is to 1. If I reversed them, of course, inverted them, we'd have 1 is to 2 or 1/2. Okay, so we have 2 to 1. Let's say I then hold up 4 pens, and we now have 2 over here. So we have 4 is to 2. Is 2 is to 1 and 4 is to 2 the same ratio, the same relationship? Yes, absolutely. That gives proportion. When you repeat a ratio, that's what analogous proportion means. The big question is, how does the divine, the one, become many, fractalized into a ratio that immediately becomes a proportion? There is only one way, and that's called the golden section, the golden ratio, which leads to the divine proportion. The divine works with absolute simplicity. You will see what I'm going to be getting at in a moment. Now, the golden section is an irrational number. It's incommensurable. It goes on to infinity. However, when we look at nature, we want to count the number of leaves on a stem, or the florets in the head of a sunflower, or a pine cone, or a flower itself. They're whole numbers. And nature has a very simple way of translating the golden ratio into simple whole number relationships. That's called the Fibonacci series of numbers that many of you are already familiar with. Begins with 0, and then you have 1. The next number is the sum of the previous two. So 0 plus 1 is 1. 1 plus 1, 2. So it goes 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34. If you take a full strand of DNA, a full twist, it is 34 angstroms in length, 21 angstroms in width. Anytime you have two adjacent Fibonacci numbers like that, 34 divided by 21, you have a close approximation to the golden ratio for these whole numbers. So now I want to take, and I hope some of you at least close can see this, this is a golden calipers. If you measure the phalanges in your finger, and that's the bone, not the flesh. So if I take the distal phalange, and basically this wider part is to the narrower part in golden relationship, no matter how wide or narrow I make it. During the Renaissance, the great artists, sculptors, would take these huge compasses, calipers, they'd actually have 3 prongs, and they would mark the navel so they would get life into the statue, and they would fractalize it, and that's why the ancient Greeks and during the Renaissance they had the most beautiful sculptures and works of art. So if I take and I measure the tip, the distal phalange, and again it's the bone structure, so it's a little bit misleading. You'll see that at the next point, a little bit wider, that's in golden relationship. So if I then take the narrow part, do the same thing here, flip it over, hopefully without moving it, you will see that it's again in golden relationship, and it's the sum of the previous two, just like the Fibonacci numbers. Our body is in this set of harmonics. All of nature is. It's not just human beings. The key about human beings is we have the conscious choice to assist in our unfoldment, as you're going to see. One other thing that would be helpful, I have a yardstick 36 inches long. Is there a way to cut the yardstick so that you get this golden relationship? Now you might immediately say, well, let's cut it in half. So we then would have 2 segments, each 18 inches long. The yardstick itself, compared to one of the segments, either segment, would be, what would be the ratio? 2 is to 1. But the relationship or ratio of the 2 pieces would be 1 to 1. Are those the same ratios? No. However, if we golden cut it, what you end up with is 22¼ inches, but remember the number 22.25. The other segment will be 13¾ inches, but remember 13.75 inches, and there's a reason for that. Right away you can start thinking of a circle and the number of degrees in a circle, and you'll start to figure out how nature works, because everything in nature as it grows is pushing out and spinning, rotating at the same time, forming spirals. So many of the experiences of people in transformative states of consciousness experience spirals. Daniel Brinkley reported that as he went up the tunnel was spiraling. Did you see this again and again? All of nature is doing this. So the last thing with this to say is, if I take the 3 segments now, I want to call this the greater, big phi, golden ratio 1.618. We'll call this unity or 1, and then the smaller piece is going to be the reciprocal of the golden ratio. It's also a golden ratio, but it's the lesser, and it's exactly the same length as this, -1, so you have 0.6180339 on to infinity. The big question for the ancients was, what is the indefinite dyad, the greater and the lesser? It's the great mystery in Plato. We know what the one is, the unity, the good, but it was a secret as to what the greater and the lesser is. And I'll tell you right now, it's the golden ratio and it's reciprocal, greater and lesser. So we'll see this as we go. Okay. So I take it that all of us are on a path. It's a quest. Everyone has a soul's purpose. And people who have the transformative experiences invariably come back aware that they have a purpose in life. We're like the plant kingdom, like the dahlias, that are unfolded here. And we are seeking transformation and metamorphosis in which we unfold like the lotus flower. Peak experiences can be defined as an existential event which dramatically transforms one's consciousness and our corresponding paradigm, our worldview. The peak experience that is probably the peak of all peak experiences is the 8th limb of yoga. It's called Samadhi. And that's simply another name for cosmic consciousness. Zen Buddhists would call it Satori. The Sikhs call it Sahaj. And there are 5 basic qualities you see that are repeated again and again at this maximum state of consciousness. Omniscience, omni, all, scienter, knowledge, total knowledge. Omnipotence, the experience of the all power. Omnipresence, being spread throughout the entire, not just the Earth or solar system or galaxy, but in potential, the entire universe. And obviously, if you're spread through the whole thing, there's no time. That's when one hits the eternal now. And then the incredible light, and then bliss or ecstasy. It seems that all of us are on a path ultimately to achieve a state of bodhisattvahood. And then you see this in this painting, Bodhisattva by Alex Gray. So there may be this ultimate human state that is enlightened. Instead of Homo sapien, we can call it Homo luminous. Now, if you're going to get it, and by that I mean get a transformative experience, it'll be either at the front end, the tail end, or in between. At the front end, I've simply used the acronym NDE, Near Birth Experience, a perinatal experience. Near birth, where one has an incredible realm of consciousness available to them. At the tail end, the approaching death experience are what used to be called deathbed visions, and an awareness and alertness and consciousness expands. Or in between. Now that can occur through initiation. Now I take it from my studies of the esoteric and the ancient wisdom that essentially initiation is not a choice of ours. We can choose to purify ourselves, but initiation is done by higher beings. Near-death experience, now we have these shared death experiences we're now recognizing, or it can occur in something like a vision quest, where one purposefully induces a state of consciousness which is transformative. Now, at the risk of making this sound like a little bit of ego jumping in here, I've got to tell you a little bit about why I'm up here and what my experience was. My initial experience, and that's me on the right, and my brother Ted on the left, and sister Kathy in the middle. When I was born, I watched myself being brought to the house from the car, and my father, the minister, I was up above the church, I was being brought to the parsonage, looking down, and I wish I was as consciously aware now as I was then, because it was much greater state of awareness than clearly it is now. But as I watched, I thought to myself, or actually said to myself, whatever that means, oh no, here we go again. As they arrived at the doorstep, the door, and they were proceeding in, that's when I felt this sinking and a blackout feeling and kind of dropped in, whatever that means. Now, it's not like at 2 months I look up at my mother and say, what the hell am I doing in this body? I want my... No. It required a series of experiences, including being accidentally run over by my father, ended up with a tire track in the side of my head, the tailpipe scraped the top of my head. It was all accidental. When I had and that triggered remembrance, helping plug in the memory. When I had my tonsils out as a child, my little sister Nancy, who's not in this picture, she also had her tonsils out. My brother Ted came up to me, shook my hand, and said, well, it's been nice knowing you. So there was a hyper alertness while I was in the hospital. They did my sister Nancy first, but it really was not a very pleasant thing because as they're rolling me in, they're rolling her out. She looks like she's gone, and on the pillow is all this blood from her mouth. So when I'm taken in, again, there's this hyper alertness. And I remember my mother reported this. I said to my mother as they gave me ether, there was a sinking feeling, again, plugging back in the memory of that initial birth state and the sinking and then the blacking out. In fact, I told her I'm feeling tired. She said it was like, I'm feeling tired, and then just kind of drifted off. But again, and several other experiences. Then at 19, for example, I had a spontaneous out-of-body experience. And I figured out basically how to do it at will. While I was at the University of Minnesota as a student, I could at will come out of the body. Trouble was that I had allowed the wall to be a block initially, and I had a mental block, literally, of getting through a barrier like that, even though I realized there was no barrier there. Trouble was I was on the 7th floor of a 14-story dormitory, and I definitely felt physical, and I could see, and I thought, oh my God, they're going to find me 7 stories down, splattered on the cement, etc. So early on, it was aesthetics. It was the beauty of horses that attracted me the most. Later, it was the human body and then nature itself. But I was just enamored with the horses. And of course, later, I realized that horses oftentimes are symbols of the entry into the higher worlds, but also into the underworld. For example, Odin rides on Schleppner, the 8-legged horse, down into the underworld. And many of the deep experiences that can occur, some do go up, but some go down. In fact, the hero's journey is more commonly a descent into the underworld and then a subsequent ascent. So I learned very early on that if I was to be of any help to our understanding of the transmutation of consciousness, and I mean transmutation, that I would have to travel a path considered forbidden by some. Now, as a professor of philosophy and religion, I can state unequivocally that religions are often as much blinds as they are avenues to truth. Now, I have great respect for religions, and religio, religare means to tie back, reconnect. And religions serve us to the degree that they assist us in the tying back. I also realized quite early on the power of focus, intention, and the development of the will. I guess I should tell you, I became a student, as you'll see, Blavatsky, Alice Bailey, Rudolf Steiner, the ancient wisdom, and so forth. But when you look at the eyes of individuals who've been switched on, you immediately see what Plato said, we transmit the energies. We see here in another painting by Alex Gray. We take the energy in, we're transformed, and then we transmit to others. And that's the beauty of a conference like this. We're surrounded by people who have had the experiences, and then we have a shared experience, and we attune with them. This is my brother Ted. He was probably the most powerful man in the world. He was Hercules incarnate. At 18, he was at the world's record in curl. Just tremendous. Look at the eyes. He was Mr. Minnesota. He had a tremendous impact on me. We were very competitive. And he got me into the bodybuilding, and then the focus and the willful intention and so forth, and I became one of the 3 top bodybuilders as a teenager in the U.S. I encountered Dr. Douglas Baker, the occultist, esotericist, world-renowned, early on. Here we're in Cape Town, South Africa, at an international festival of yoga and esoteric sciences. He had a big impact on me. And he switched me on to H.P. Blavatsky and the Secret Doctrine, and that's where I started. I then later go to college, but it starts with esoteric training first. From Blavatsky, I learned that Plato is the world's interpreter. Some of these beings are coming from the future into the present. In Theosophy, the view is Siddhartha Gautama was a 6th rounder coming into the present. Plato was a 5th rounder. We're now in the 4th round. Furthermore, she pointed out that the ideas of Pythagoras and Plato are identical with ours. Most significantly, she pointed out that it is the golden proportional symmetry that was revealed in the ancient initiations passed down by the adepts of the 4th root race. It is within this initiatory tradition of the mysteries that, quote, all the rules of proportion are those taught anciently at initiations, and one should acquaint oneself with the truly divine art and understand the deep esoteric significance hidden in every rule and law of proportion. Now, those are her italics. That's not my emphasis. Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, page 208. So I became totally switched on to Plato, the mind-body relationship with the bodybuilding, but also more so in the intellectual study of his epistemology, how we come to know, and his ontology or metaphysics, what exists. And one of the ancient traditions has it that the canon of Polyclitus, who was in charge of the sculptures of the Parthenon and on the Acropolis, had a canon based upon the golden ratio. Unfortunately, we only have little fragments left. But the Doryphorus embodied the canon. Now, we only unfortunately have Roman copies, but the Romans were pretty good about the copying. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was up in Minnesota and went back to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and was doing measurements with this statue that they paid $2.5 million for. It's kind of the centerpiece of their museum. So while I'm at the University of Minnesota then, I write Platonic Aesthetics in my summa cum laude thesis. Others who have really influenced me, particularly Houston Smith. He's become a very, very close friend over the years. He just did the foreword for my new book, Divine Proportion, The Mathematical Perfection of the Universe. While I was studying with him in 1994 at Berkeley for the summer, I wrote Plato and the Divine Proportion, Ascent to the First Principles. And so there's a sense in which it can be, as I said, a downward descent into the underworld, but it can also be an ascent up out of the cave into states of illumination. Both of them are transformative, and both situations are meaningful to us. What I encountered was what the ancient Egyptians called the primordial scission, the scission, the first cut. And it's the greatest philosophical problem: how does the one become many? And it does it through the most economical, simple way, because immediately if you cut in a golden cut like this, and if this is the greater, symbolized by big phi, the greater, Greek letter, and I'll call this little phi, the reciprocal, here's the greater as the whole, here's the lesser, here's the geometric mean between the two. That is the key. When Hermes says, as above, so below, and as below, so above, you must have the intermediate, but that was the forbidden part. You need a meso between the macrocosm and the microcosm. And that's where the geometric structuring comes in. So here's an example of one of those calipers, three-pronged, like was used in the Renaissance by Michelangelo and the others. But you see what I was showing you earlier with the phalanges. Everything, we are harmonics of the golden ratio. We are created in the image of God, but so is everything else. Everything has this throughout nature. We're not special, other than we have that free will choice where we can assist to some degree our spiritual metamorphosis. So here from my book is the golden cut. Plato says, take a line. He tells you, cut it unevenly. And scholars are wondering, what the heck does he mean by that? Well, again, there's only one way to cut a line, so that the whole is to the longer segment as the longer is to the shorter, golden relationship. That's how the universe has fractalized, fractured, from top to bottom. It's scale independent. There is not a place, when I have students ask me, well, where do you find the golden ratio? Is it only out there in those sunflowers and pine cones? I have not found a place that it does not exist. And it is now solving the most intractable problems of physics. The bonding together of quantum mechanics with relativity theory, the double slit experiment, wave-particle duality, and I could go on and on and on. It's the basis of the fine structure constant. We now know, we really actually, people are thinking we haven't solved it. It has been solved. But it's difficult to get the attention sometimes. So the whole line there is to the upper, as that is to the lower, in the same ratio, as you see this is to this, in the same ratio as this segment here is to the little bitty segment down there. And what happens here is this is actually Plato's divided line. All I did was take a compass, put the point here, compass point, pencil lead there, arc down, cut it here, and I was able to solve the 2,400-year-old problem. It's a very simple move, but that's what Plato did. He had a logic called abduction, retroduction, apagoge, was rediscovered by Charles Sanders Peirce. And that is the logic of creative reasoning into higher hypotheses. It's the only way we get new knowledge. And in fact, Samadhi and other forms of climactic experiences of consciousness are these incredible abductions in which all of a sudden one becomes aware in a non-temporal, non-spatial, non-local situation. And that's why some of these people can download so much incredible consciousness when they come back. So there have been, in the last year and a half, profound new insights into the dominating role of the divine proportion or golden section. And it's taking the world of both science and aesthetics by storm. For example, on January 7th, 2010, teams of physicists collaborating in England, at Bristol University, and Germany reported their empirical observation of the golden section as the principle of symmetry at the heart of quantum mechanics. This had actually been discovered before, but because they rounded off the number, the experts, the two experts, Roger Penrose and the other one, he's even greater intellect in physics, is Muhammad El-Nashi. Both of them missed it, but it was because they had rounded it off. And as I'll show you in a little bit, it turns out that the solution, for example, to non-locality and entanglement, turns out to be the lesser, the 0.618, taken to its fifth power. We now know how non-locality and locality, therefore, are integrated. And it'll probably have a great thing to do in terms of consciousness and its relationship to the brain. And the movement from wave to particle and back and forth. Recently, there have been some stunning discoveries into the underlying role of the golden section-centered dynamic symmetry. The golden section does not create a static symmetry. It is absolutely dynamic. It now appears to be central to physics, winding number, fine structure constant, even the quark masses we've now discovered are functions of the golden ratio. And of course, they make up the electrons, protons, and so forth. All of nature is resonating to the same principle. We now see it in the periodic table of elements, biology, and plant phyllotaxis. Phyllo is leaf, taxis is arrangement, how the leaves will arrange themselves on the stem. Genetics. Genetics follows a Fibonacci organization. The nucleotides organize through the Fibonacci numbers. DNA structure, the DNA, as you'll see, you do a sagittal section, you get a decagon. Well, a decagon, as you're going to see pentagons, it's made up of two pentagons. Anytime you have a pentagon, you have a pentagram. Anytime you have a pentagram, you immediately have golden ratios. Same thing with the crown chakra, 1,000 petals. If you think about it, you have 100 decagons, that means 200 pentagons. We go into resonance with it, we tie it, and it's through the golden ratio. In heart physiology, computer technology, encryption, astronomy, music, weather turbulence, the winding number of a hurricane is the same winding number that you find with subatomic particles, 137.5 degrees, by the way. Beauty and the unfolding of consciousness itself. A deep recognition is arising amongst many scholars, scientists, aestheticians, and leading thinkers that the underlying mathematics of harmony permeates all aspects of life, including consciousness. So in the beginning, John chapter 1, verse 1 was the logos, was the initial ratio. Before you have the logos, there's the one. But the one to manifest has to go through the process. That's why most religions, actually the Christians were taught this by the Neoplatonists in Alexandria. Hindus, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. It's the middle member of the Trinity. Father, Son, Holy Son is the middle member that bonds together the two extremes, and it's the logos. We even see it in various paintings involving, like this one from Manly Palmer Hall's artist, with the kundalini coming up the spine, coming up into the head region, stimulating the pineal and pituitary glands, and symbolized by various mythologies, sticking the spear into the cup and so forth, and the Hyros Gamos, Hyros sacred Gamos marriage in the head. And it is all resonance, attunement. Atoms are called vibrations in occultism, according to H.P. Blavatsky. Rupert Sheldrake and morphic resonance. So species can transmit their new knowledge to other members of the species directly. It's like wave-like. You don't have to be a particle going to another particle. There's interconnection. Actually, beyond Sheldrake is Goodwin, and Brian Goodwin, in How the Leopard Changed Its Spots. What Goodwin recognized is, yes, there's morphic resonance, but it's structured by the Platonic solids. And what are the Platonic solids? They're all the ratios. Golden section, square root of 2, square root of 3, those are the three biggies. They tie everything together. And one of the things that I discovered, and probably known for most, is I showed how root 2 and root 3 can be manufactured out of the golden ratio. So we find, as in this article, Becoming One in Music and Minds, musicians who play and sing also have brains that fall into alignment. Researchers at the Planck Institute in Germany and the University of Salzburg showed that the brainwaves of guitarists playing a jazz tune together became synchronized as they performed. Huygens, early on, recognized that if you have two pendulums out of sync, they eventually will go into entrainment. They'll go into synchrony. The relative sitting at the bedside of the dying patient goes into synchrony and resonates with their experiences of life reviews and what's happening to them out of the body and so forth. When I was in Peru with the group, we reintroduced to the Carolingians, the remnants of the Incas, the whistling vessels that they have in their museums. And these whistling vessels take one into these altered states of consciousness in each culture, the Mocha, Inca, Quimo, they each had a slightly different note. It's very amazing how that worked. So from my book, this little comment, Resonance in Consciousness, Buddhas, Shamans, and Microtubules. Consciousness is one of the great mysteries of humanity. Like life itself, it may result from a resonance between the divine whole and nature, the parts, exquisitely tuned by the amazing fractal properties of the golden ratio, allowing for states of awareness and growing states of awareness. So here's a microtubule. Here it is from a top view. And DNA, here's a sagittal view of DNA, where you have two pentagons superimposed, all golden ratios. As we're going to see, the microtubules are made up of 13 tubulin. We haven't really gotten into Fibonacci numbers enough yet. That's a Fibonacci number. 8 spiraling one way, 5 spiraling the other. 13 is to 8 is to 5. These are the harmonics of the golden ratio. And at the tips of the microtubules are clathrons. Clathrons are buckyballs. They're like a soccer ball. They're a truncated icosahedron. If you take an edge, and notice you have a pentagon here surrounded by 5 hexagons, you take an edge, and that's 1, or unity, you run across to the opposite side, it's exactly 3 times the golden ratio. It's all multiples or divisions of the golden ratio. I was able to get this from a friend, this from Dennis Gabor's laboratory. These are slide pictures of the earliest holograms ever produced. This is the bottom of a tin can resonating at different frequencies. So you see how sound is transformed into shape. When I was at Sharp Cathedral, I took this picture, and again, the light, the wave particle phenomena, we don't know for sure, but sometimes we get these images. There's a transformation right before our eyes. So it's sacred geometry is one of the doorways that I've come through. And sacred geometry is the fractalized unfoldment of the many out of the one and the resonant reconnection of each of those many back to the one. So here was my teacher, probably the top sacred geometer in the world, Keith Critchlow. He was a student of Bucky Fuller. In fact, he was Bucky Fuller's main disciple student. Here I'm with his grandson, Brock, and we're building these platonic models and nesting other platonic models inside. And what happens is you get all these sacred resonances. In fact, mathematicians have missed this. Euclid's Elements is a building from point line planes to book 13 solids, 5 regular solids, platonic solids, and their mathematical relationships. Golden ratio number 1, root 2, root 3 as well. Here I'm at COSM doing a workshop with Alex Gray here in the center. This is Lance Harding, happens to be the world's expert on canons of human proportion, Dan Duddy, and Zachariah Gregory, who did a few drawings for my book. This is the core of E8. E8 is now being recognized as the center of subatomic high-energy physics. And of course, that's just a kind of a beginning model. There's so much more complex, but it's got all the sacred geometric principles we're talking about now. The last time this really was done correctly was back in 1509, when Luca Pacioli, known as the monk drunk on beauty, wrote Divina Proporzione. It was illustrated by Leonardo da Vinci. Here he's got this is Da Vinci now, making a drawing of a dodecahedron. The dodecahedron, as you see, is composed of faces that are pentagons. Anytime you have a pentagon, you immediately have golden ratios at work. Here's, like the clathrons, here's your truncated icosahedron. Notice again, pentagons surrounded by 5 hexagons. Leonardo da Vinci. Sometimes you find it even in a single plant. Now, the hexagon is the closest packing of space. The pentagon is consciousness and life. So you'll see, not only do you get pentagons and pentagrams, but you get hexagons and hexagrams and so forth. Just like you had in that truncated icosahedron. By the way, they are now using, for the treatment of AIDS, they make these cages using nanotechnology made out of these truncated icosahedrons, and they put the medicine in, and that's how they get in to work on the HIV virus. HIV virus, by the way, this is the problem. Both the most beautiful, well, put it another way, both the most sacred but also the most diabolic things will operate using the same structure. So the HIV virus turns out to be an icosahedron. Golden ratios throughout. That's why it's so difficult to deal with. Holograms and fractals. I had the benefit of having as one of my professors, in fact, I met with only 2 other students in his office at Birkbeck College, David Bohm, the great physicist. And this is what Bohm said. The essential features of quantum interconnectedness are that the whole universe is in some way enfolded in everything, and that each individual thing is enfolded back into the whole. That was in the undivided universe. Sometimes we refer this enfolding in nature to a kind of bio-like mathematics. Scientific American 2 years ago had this cover, "Are you a hologram?" Quantum physics says the entire universe might be. Now they're suggesting, in fact, this is the case. In other words, everything is a microcosm of the entire universe. For those in the religious realm here, that means the Christ is within, as well as without. Buddha consciousness is right here, inside of you. We are the entire universe, we just have not awakened to it. That's what the transformative experience is all about. And the universe is now being seen as fractal. So that means if you take any portion of it and blow it up, you realize you've got the same overall pattern. And it is scale independent. We've observed this at every level, from the galactic clusters all the way down, as I said, to the quarks and everything in between. It's all resonant. So the hero's journey, and many of these things I had to truncate and just kind of shorten them up. But the hero's journey in mythology, the monomyth, the one great myth, is basically the death of the lower self, the ego, to in turn give birth to the new self, the attunement, the higher self, in an act of re-identification. So in the mythology, sometimes you come up the mountain like the goat in Capricorn, the sign of initiation, right up. But on the other hand, it's more often a descent into the underworld, as you'll notice in much of Joseph Campbell's work. And here we have Jason emerging with the goddess Athena, who's also a goddess of wisdom. And he's emerging up through the mouth of the serpent or dragon. Same thing happens with the shamanic experiences of the Huichol Indians. And I want you to notice the serpentine curvature, but at the end of the path, they also, it's common to recognize this pentagonal structure. This is why the majority of wildflowers are pentagonal, have 5 petals. The others generally fall into Fibonacci number relationships. Even the lily, 6 petals, look closely, it's 3 and 3. So as the Huichol say, one enters into the depths of reality through a great swirling, spiraling tunnel of brilliant color. The Huichols call this doorway a Nirika, leading to a new world that is much more stable and divinely balanced. It's all alchemical. It is transformative. It is truly transmutation. That's how the sun is a alchemical furnace. Everything in nature is going through transformation. The question is, can we speed it up? Can we make choices? Do we have to wait for accidents? Or can we assist? You see, in the same year as I was working on Plato, I was also working on alchemy as well as the Platonic aesthetics. So in this alchemical painting taken from Don't Seize the Power of Limits, you see a peacock inside the vessel. Jane Petra was referring the other day to the peacock which spread its tail. Well, guess what? The eyes of the peacock's tail, they're Fibonacci relationships, Fibonacci spirals. And so when it gets turned on, it's going into resonance with the golden ratio. Knowledge of the golden mean, and it's reciprocal, greater and lesser, not only reveals the reality of nature itself, but also allows humanity to consciously participate in metamorphosis or self-transformation. It is the essence of alchemy, and for that matter, of religion itself. Religion in its highest, deepest sense. So, from Kunrath's amphitheater of wisdom, you look around and you immediately notice musical instruments. And again, the symbols. Many people try to decipher the text, but oftentimes they miss the symbolism. So we see the individual here at his altar, on his knees, in a state of worship in his temple. We look a little closer at what's in the altar. You see right away, And you see the equilateral triangle where you get the root 3 from the cube. You get, anytime you have a square, you do a diagonal bisection and you get root 2. This is a cover of another alchemical text, Christ in the center of this hexagram, which is, of course, a hexagon. Let's do this quickly. Oops. I should go back for a second. I want you to notice down here in the corner, tincture. Tincture is the philosopher's stone. NDEs and out-of-body experiences. As we know, Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper in Mindsight pointed out that in both NDEs and OBEs, oftentimes people who are blind, and even congenitally blind from birth, have a kind of visual perception. Now, when I interviewed Ken Ring years ago at the University of Hartford at one of these conferences, we discussed this, and both of us have been of the opinion, he was the same, I brought it up, synesthesia, the crossing over the senses. Everything is vibratory. And so it's not like when people have perceptions while out of the body who've been blind, that they're looking through a pair of eyes. First time I had an out-of-body experience, before I came out of the body, I realized I was looking in all directions simultaneously. And I've seen other NDEers and out-of-body experiencers who had the same kind of experience. P.M.H. Atwater, in this wonderful book, Beyond the Light, speaks of George Rodinaya, who experienced bubbles like balls of molecules and atoms, round, moving, dividing into parts, electrons, protons, dividing into other parts, turning into energy. Eternal life-making self, all moving in spirals, spinning, rotating, growing. What had seemed chaotic actually had symmetry. You realize, and I have this in my little golden section book, if you get it, notice there's a golden physics, one page at the end. It shows all of these golden relationships in quantum physics, but also the chaos border between order and disorder goes through a window. Guess what rules the window? Take a guess. The golden ratio, golden section. And probably one of the finest books on near-death experiences I have ever encountered, again, P.M.H. Atwater, wonderful book. Near-death experiences, the rest of the story. As she points out on page 141, through the ages, sacred initiations of the greatest order demanded a death. Seldom physical. They required death of the ego. And then she goes on to say about what's called a colloidal condition. A colloidal condition is a peculiar in-between state that occurs when forces suddenly collapse and then converge. Particles called colloids caught in this intermediate, remember the geometric mean between the extremes, in this unique state between implosion and explosion, transmute and remain forever changed by the transmutation. Just like people who go through a near-death or other type of transformative experience, they're changed for life. And as Dr. Grayson was pointing out, when they do these interviews 20, 30 years later, it still has had the same incredible empowering effect upon them. One of the people that impressed me the most, he's an example of this deep downloading of consciousness and wisdom from the other side, was Tom Sawyer. Here's this book by far called What Tom Sawyer Learned from Dying. Actually, what I'm quoting from here is from Transformed by the Light. A large number of people claim transformations that were paranormal. Some claim that they had achieved much higher intelligence after their NDE. One, a snowplow operator in upstate New York, with the all-American name of Tom Sawyer, found himself writing a string of numbers and symbols within a year of his experience. He didn't know why he wrote them or what they meant, but he frequently found himself doodling during coffee breaks or in the evening after work. When he showed these musings to a college professor, he found that he was writing the equations of Max Planck, a physicist who contributed much to what we know about atomic theory. Sawyer now says that his near-death experience was a short course in nuclear physics. But why and how did a person with a high school education get such information? Was it from the light? Well, this is a phenomenon that I'm very interested in, and any of you who've had near-death experiences and have had this type of downloading of higher states of consciousness. I'm very interested. And also in your experiences of the geometry of nature that you find on the other side. This is the book Transformed by the Light, Melvin Morris, and also Olaf Sunden. Died during a tonsillectomy and was shown the mathematics of nature, what he called my cosmic gift. He now holds over 100 chemical patents. Although Olaf wanted to stay with the light, he felt his mind splitting into two parts, with that portion that understood everything being left behind. He saw it disappear above him as a beautiful, bright galaxy of light, while he was forced into a tunnel and back into his body. I remember thinking, he said, please let me understand this new physics of relativity. Then he felt this bump, was caught in a channel, transported by a tremendous force back into the body. But he said, I collected all my power to remember the cosmic comprehension of the universal machine. And as we know from Gazaniga's work, severing or using an anesthetic with the corpus callosum, we're actually two brains. Now what's interesting is the more spiritual self seems to be more allied to the right non-dominant hemisphere. And oftentimes you see those who talk of a daemon, a higher self, working through it. And of course he had this thing received. Left hemisphere is more analytic, down to earth. The near-death experience immediately changed Olaf's character. He went from being an average student to one who was arrogant and even heretical. Refusing explanations in his school, he used theories he'd learned on the other side to explain what Albert Einstein had to say. Now when you see a chambered nautilus and you see the spiral, you again are seeing this is mnemonic growth, and it is based upon the golden ratio. In Atwater's Children of the New Millennium, there's a young boy, Tom Mears, who reported going through a tunnel. But the tunnel, or the spiral, I should say in this case, again is evident. But we see it everywhere in spiral galaxies. The clairvoyant C.W. Leadbeater saw it in what they call the ultimate physical atom, the Anu. And now this has been corroborated by other clairvoyants, and so you find this incredible spiralized structure. Even in visual perception, we now realize it's going through not only what we see, but how we see is the subjective and objective. There's an interplay, and it's through a golden section field. And then we then have Raymond Moody's recent interest in the profound significance of shared death experiences. Or Kuika, who came back with these incredible images. You can see here, here's a icosahedron with all the golden ratios in it, and a Sri Yantra, which also, by the way, has golden ratios involved in it. You need to look at the work of Stephen Phillips, the theosophist physicist in England. Fibonacci numbers and phylotexts, it's in the symmetry in plants that we see these incredible things going on. And there's a puzzle. Is there really a primordial design? Is there really order behind the seemingly infinite diversity that we see in nature? And so we see three types of phylotexts. These are the three main types. You have the distichus at 180 degrees, side to side, as we have in corn. You have the whorl that goes at basically 90 degrees. You have like cross like this, and that. But then you have the spiral. And in the spiral, you're allowed the maximum moisture, sunlight, pollination by insects. It swirls, it rotates the moisture down into the roots, and guess what? 4 out of 5 of all the known, and I can guarantee you there's at least equal amount that's unknown in these rainforests, but 4 out of 5 all plants use spiral phyllotaxis. The rotation angle is limited to a few values, most common 137.5 degrees. Remember cutting the yardstick, 13.75 degrees. So here's phyllotaxis with the leaf arrangement. So you see how the spiraling works. Here are Fibonacci numbers. Remember, a full spiral, full twist of DNA is 34 by 21, 34 angstroms by 21. When you take the Fibonacci numbers and the adjacent ones and you make ratios, you see what happens. You go from 1 over 1, which is 1, 2 over 1. So you go from the 1 in the dyad, and then very quickly, 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. 5 divided by 3, 1.666. 8 divided by 5, 1.6. Even the sacred geometric structures, Ark of the Covenant, 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits, 5 by 3, golden racial resonance. And what's happening is asymptotically it's moving towards the limit, and there's the teleology. Everything is being pulled towards the divine cut in the limit. So you see the Fibonacci numbers, you actually get 3 in a pineapple. Pineapples get a little more complex. Pine cones are very simple. Usually, if you can get one that has not lost all of its and the seeds at the base, you flip it over. This one, for example, is 13 by 8. And again, golden ratio. Mountain sheep horns. I found when I went to Odessa in the Ukraine, the Russians and Ukrainians actually have a greater degree of knowledge about this subject than we do. That's why I have several of them contributing to my new book, Divine Proportion. So non-locality, Edgar Mitchell, on the way back from the moon, goes into an epiphany, goes into a state of samadhi, as he describes it, writes the way of the explorer. And he finds that as a result of non-local information, people have these religious and mystical experiences, and they penetrate into what he refers to as the zero-point field. I spoke with him at a conference together. He did Frontiers of Consciousness studies. I'm only pointing this out, consciousness, resonance, and self-identity. What happens is we identify with a greater notion of ourself, all the way up to the divine self itself. And I'll skip through a couple of these, but again, it's all non-local resonance. It's again a quote from Edgar Mitchell. But we also now know that non-locality, which is the basis of entanglement, we know what it is. We actually have the formula. It was discovered several years ago, but people missed it because they rounded the number off. This really should be 0.09, but when you make it a percent, this is correct. So entanglement works with this percentage, and I noticed that some of my symbols got removed here. It's the golden ratio, the lesser, to the 5th power. Here's the genius right here, Muhammad al-Nashi, who in 1994 wrote his quantum space a random Cantor set with the golden dimension mean at the core. He also wrote this paper, a note on the subtle mean in physics. And notice right away what it is. It's the greater to the 3rd power, 1.618 to the 3rd power, which is 4.236, Egyptian mysteries. Badawi discovered everywhere on the Giza Plateau that they're using Fibonacci numbers and golden ratios in their architectural designs. And one of the good things is the casing stones are still there at the bottom, and you can actually see the angle. You can figure it out. And I guarantee you it's all golden ratio. And of course, some of us do the measurements. Some of us get maybe a little carried away in our remembrance of what should happen. And we eyeball the coffer, and the next thing you jump inside. Next thing you know, you're up on the top of the thing, looking at Coffer's pyramid. Of course, I had to climb it, as you know. But this is what it looks like from the top, by the way. It's tough to get up there. It's much tougher to get down. But also, there are these angles. This leads nowhere. And always the question is, what the heck is this? This is at a 26.5 degree angle. It is actually an angle that is used to construct a golden rectangle. The ascending passageway in the pyramid and the descending passageway in the pyramid are the same angle, 26.5 degrees. And guess what? These geniuses, much brighter than us. How? Well, you have to think about that one and adopt your solution. But on the summer solstice, Robert Temple discovered that it casts a shadow. Khafra's pyramid casts a shadow on the south side of the Great Pyramid, 26.5 degrees. Here's the internal structure of the key triangle in the Great Pyramid, and you see big phi, square root of phi, here's unity. In the Temple of Man, the alchemist Egyptologist Schwaller de Lubitsch said the golden section, phi, is not a product of mathematical imagination, but the natural principle of the laws of equilibrium. Quantum computers, microtubule. Look at the spirali, the spirals involved in it. Roger Penrose in Shadows of the Mind makes a big thing about microtubules, but guess what? They're made up of 13 tubulin, of tubulin dimers, 8 spiraling one way, 5 spiraling the other. Penrose says, why do Fibonacci numbers arise in microtubule structure? You know, because it's the resonance that it creates. Here's the clathrons we've already looked at. But here's where the microtubules are, clathrons at the synaptic cleft. And that's where the consciousness, at least while the brain is still active, but remember, in quantum mechanics, you have superposition. Brain can be shut down. It's the mathematics that's involved that is not required that you have physical, particle-like substance the way we normally think of it. You'll see some of this in The Day I Die. Many of you are familiar with that. And then in Enlightenment magazine, Finding Spirit in the Fabric of Space-Time, Stuart Hameroff, beautiful imagery, great thoughts. Kim Van Lommel, in a wonderful book, Consciousness Beyond Life, points this out. Initiation at Eleusis. Now I'm going to run through very quickly a series of slides without much comment. This is Eleusis. This is where 4,000 people in the Telesterion would go through this incredible climax of consciousness, forbidden to reveal what happened, but we can tell from some of the grave markers, including the blind. And this one stela, Eucrates, refers to the fact that though he was blind during the experience, he saw. And if you study carefully, you see what plants were involved, and of course you see the pentagrams, the hexagrams. This is the cave of Dionysus that I entered into the day they opened the Hadron Collider, the original temple of Apollo. Here's Apollo's temple. There I am. I talked the guards into letting me go down where the Pythia was. Shamanic experience, now and quickly. There's a very good reason there's shape-shifting and identification with the animal kingdom. Usually the big cats, because of the top of the food chain. We see this in all cultures. You take on their consciousness, they take on the human consciousness. There's a resonance that is created. I wanted to show this for one of you in the audience. Sri Narasimha, the fourth incarnation of Vishnu, was the lion-headed man. Well, we see it with Shiva seated on the tiger skin. The ancient Egyptians, you see with the leopard skin. The Africans, obviously, they're shamans. Some wannabes who in Cape Town, South Africa, they all lead it up. The Huichol Indians, not only the plants, but also in the sacred geometry, but the jaguars, when they come out of their deep spiritual consciousness. Last time I wrote a book, Golden Section, Nature's Greatest Secret. I went into isolation, into the Peruvian rainforest. Here's where I was working. I gave the shamans a picture because they knew I was having the experiences with the jaguars. I thought they were going to create a picture of the body of the jaguar. What they did is they took my head, my face from this, and superimposed the jaguar on one side of it. So again, we ride on the animals into these higher states. And again, it's a quest, whether it's on a horse or however it's done. We're all looking for this, the grail, the stone, the philosopher's stone ultimately. So I came up with the golden section, Nature's Greatest Secret. Later I worked with Alexei Stakov in the Mathematics of Harmony, from Euclid to Contemporary Mathematics and Computer Science. Probably the most advanced book that I know of in modern mathematics. Very expensive, it's about $140. The little golden section book is $12. In particular, was Stakov's work on Fibonacci computers, algorithmic measurement theory, encryption coding theory, applications to quantum physics, biology, aesthetic theory, is leading the way for the development of a new golden paradigm. I think the goal of humanity is ultimately this higher, more complete state, homo luminous, our ultimate goal. And in this painting by C.W. Leadbeater, we get the kind of image of what it might be to enter this final state. At least relatively speaking, there'll be many states after that. This is a cover of the new book I'm doing, Divine Proportion, The Mathematical Perfection of the Universe, Near-Death Experiences in Self-Transformation, Life-Changing Illumination as Humanity's Ultimate Goal. Thank you very much.